The morning began with a quiet the city never seemed to notice. It hung in the air like a breath no one wanted to release, cool, steadied by a faint breeze that moved the leaves in small, undecided gestures. Jack Morrison stood before the memorial wall as if he were the last sentry on a post long abandoned. Names flowed across the polished stone in solemn rivers, each one a world that ended in a year and a rank. His hand rose, trembled, steadied. He touched a particular name with 2 fingers, the way one might brush dust from the corner of a photograph. The stone was cold, indifferent to his warmth. The morning sun, still low and pale, set a sheen across the wall that mirrored him back as a thin, silver-gray silhouette. In that reflection he saw the same face he had tried not to watch in mirrors, a face scored by time, pull of gravity at the mouth, the slight yellowness that never seemed to leave his eyes anymore. He had woken at 4 again to the familiar pulse just under the right rib, a dull drum calling a rhythm he had not agreed to. The first wave of pain folded him forward, an old friend with a new tone. He let it crest through him, tried to ride it the way a man rides an unexpected swell. He kept one palm on the stone, not to steady himself so much as to remember what steadiness felt like. When the pain receded, the world sharpened again, a crow hopping along the curb, a runner's footfalls skimming the path, the scent of wet earth after an overnight sprinkle. The name beneath his fingers, Lucas M. Hale, was a doorway that opened onto a distant and permanent afternoon. The jungle closing behind 2 men as a helicopter became a bright dragonfly, and then a speck, and then nothing at all. He did not venture through the doorway, not now. The wall was a place for arrivals, not departures. He took the envelope from his coat pocket and unfolded it, knowing its contents by heart, the crisp printout, the unmoved typography, the clinic's logo in the corner like a stamp of governance. It was the kind of paper that seemed to make sounds even when it didn't move. Hepatocellular carcinoma. The words were not new, not by this stage, but the phrase below warranted air from nowhere. 3 months. If the body and time had a treaty, it was being rewritten in secret rooms to which he did not have a key. He had nodded in the doctor's office as a small map of the liver lit up on a screen islands of contrast that were not meant to be there, a geography of unwelcome. He remembered the grain of the desk, the faint lemon of cleaning wipes, the way the second hand on the wall clock did not tick but glided indifferent to his moment of snowfall. He remembered the physician's voice, careful and humane, the way one speaks while guiding someone down a narrow stair in the dark. The days around that appointment blurred into quiet acts of inventory. He watched the way the morning light moved across the floorboards and thought about the varnish he had promised to redo. He ran a finger along picture frames to measure dust. He opened drawers and found little treaties with his former lives, a service ribbon he had kept folded in a handkerchief, a key to a storage unit he had emptied years ago, a receipt for boots, now 2 sizes past. Every object came with a small explanation, and then with another explanation beneath that one, as if his life were written on onion skin paper, translucent histories stacked in a drawer. He stopped at the window when a neighbor's boy tossed a ball alone. The arc, pure and optimistic, the catch, sometimes clean and sometimes clapped fumbles that produced laughter. Children made a habit of forgiving themselves quickly. It astonished him what a skill that was. Night became a series of stations. Sleep was a train that stopped and started, and each waking found him on a new platform. He would press his palm to his side, count the steady drumming of his heart, try to pair breath with the second hand only he could hear. He thought at first about odds and statistics, about graphs he had been shown, and the infinitely polite language meant to soften impact. He tried on defiance like an old jacket. He tried on surrender the same way. He tried on a simple and practical acceptance, and it fit better than either, though he sensed that acceptance was not a permanent garment, but a shawl one pulls on when the air cools. If he could not choose the end, he could choose the furniture of the days leading up to it. This thought came like a candle and stuck. On the kitchen counter, a legal pad began to fill with lists, not the kind he once wrote for groceries or errands, but leaner, syllable-light keys. Documents. The blue box in the top closet. Letters unsent. He marked a line and wrote a name above it, a name he rarely let himself say out loud. His pen paused there, hovering. He left the line empty for the time being and turned to the kettle instead. The whistle that rose from it felt too loud for the small kitchen. He lifted it early, the sound caught mid-birth. He poured water over tea and watched the brown fan outward, a soft delta. He wondered whether his own days would stain outward or simply lift and leave no trace. He did not tell many. There were not many to tell. The ones who would have insisted on riding shotgun through the appointments had scattered long ago along the routes time opens, when it does not want vehicles to collide. There was an old friend 2 towns over who still sent cards on Veterans Day, a woman named Sarah, from a support group years back who had moved states, a physician who knew his case from the inside and whose name had become something Jack could say and feel steadier, Dr. Pierce. The doctor did not promise and did not condescend, and that made the air in the exam room breathable. The doctor spoke of options and palliatives and the arithmetic of timelines, careful to call them estimates and not calendars. Jack had nodded the nod away to keep something inside from breaking open. He left with a folder and a prescription and the odd feeling that he had been measured with a tailor's tape. In the days after, the house became both sanctuary and echo. He found himself taking on small tasks with ceremonial attention, wiping the stovetop, arranging books by a strange mix of size and memory, rolling a rug to see the floor underneath as if the wood had news for him. The mail brought its ordinary collection of appeals and bills and postcards, but he met them at the door like a gatekeeper deciding what each one might mean about his remaining days. Most went to the bin, one did not. The card's front was a simple drawing in the confident lines of a child's marker, set 2 stick figures with comically long legs running under a sun that had far too many rays, as if the sun were a compass confused about where it should point. The caption spelled as the boy heard it read, "Mr. Jack, we run soon, K." There was a small dog drawn like an asterisk, and a corner of the paper was smudged with what might have been grape jelly. He did not remember giving the neighbor's boy his mailbox number, but children find ways as easily as water does. He stood in the doorway and read the 3 words again. The sun's too many rays made a kind of sense now. He propped the card against the sugar bowl, and it filled the kitchen with a faint electricity. The pain did not go away, but it stopped feeling like a sentence and began to feel like a message. If the body was speaking, he owed it the courtesy of listening. He walked 2 blocks that afternoon, the cold hitching in his lungs, then 3 blocks the next day. He learned again the politics of breath, how the nose and mouth negotiate under exertion, how the chest becomes a bellows that asks for patience. He kept his eyes on the ground the first days because the sidewalk was an essay in unevenness, but by the week's end he looked up and noticed the way the willow by the pond had begun even this late in the year to consider greening at the tips. A small prologue the tree apparently could not restrain. He took this as an argument about what beginnings look like. At night, when the house felt too empty to be a home, he opened a box that had not been opened in years and sat with the contents the way one sits with a witness. There were patches and photographs and 2 letters he had once started to write and never posted. He did not read the letters. He put his fingers on the words and let the ink carry emotion the way old wood carries heat. He allowed himself to remember the heat and steam of that far country, the sound of helicopters cutting the sky to ribbons, the smell of soil that got under the nails and then under everything else. He remembered what it had meant to carry another man's fear and how it taught him to set down his own for a while. He remembered the oath that had not been spoken but had lived between them like air as long as a heartbeat another step. It was not bravery so much as a habit learned in days so loud you could not hear your thoughts. He touched the corners of a faded photograph and realized his hands had stopped trembling. The kitchen became a laboratory of small experiments in making a morning. He sliced a lemon and watched the knife slip through the bright yellow rind, the scent suddenly a cathedral. He warmed water and poured it into a mug too big for the task. He liked the weight of it in his hand, then squeezed half the lemon until seeds fell and floated like punctuation. He drank the mixture before dawn on an empty stomach and felt a quiet lift in the body he had been instructed to expect only declines from. Sunlight, when it finally arrived, met him on the porch. He stood in it like a student. He let it draw maps on his face and neck and forearms. He did not stay long enough to redden. He stayed long enough to feel the sun address him directly. He began to learn greens the way some men learn birds. Leaves he had once ignored now announced themselves the serrated boldness of dandelion, the clean minerality of celery, the earthy sweetness of beets that left their red on everything they touched, and the workmanlike solidity of potatoes, the friendly orange of carrots, the pale humility of daikon. He fed these things into a machine that whirred his kitchen up to a hummingbird's tempo, and what came out into the glass was not beautiful if beauty meant symmetry. It was beautiful if beauty meant the body remembering the taste of what it needed. He drank slowly as one does at a ceremony. If the face he made at the bitterness amused him, he let it. A man should find reasons to smile in a house that does not yet know if it will outlast him. Some afternoons he walked by the elementary school and timed his steps to the bell. On a corner he could see from his porch the neighbor boy Billy practiced wheelies on a too-small bicycle and sometimes succeeded for a shining second. The boy's ankle sock often slouched, then righted itself as if it, too, would not be defeated. Billy waved when he saw Jack. The boy's wave had the excitement of a greeting always on the brink of becoming an invitation. Jack waved back with a smaller motion, unsure whether he had the right to be adopted by this day's brightness. One afternoon, the boy coasted to a stop near Jack and had something to say, a whole paragraph of it, the words tumbling and tumbling. Jack caught half and pretended to catch the rest the way one does with children, because the intention is the message. He nodded, and then patted the boy's shoulder with a hand that looked to him suddenly like his father's, thick and full of maps. When he went to the clinic for a follow-up, he carried a new steadiness in his gait. The waiting room was a soft geography of worry stitched with magazine pages. He signed his name and sat in a chair that took him in like a parent. The blood draw sting was small, the tape snug over the cotton. The phlebotomist made a gentle joke about his stubborn veins. He found himself returning a gentler one, and the air lifted 2 degrees. When Dr. Pierce stepped into the exam room and took his seat, Jack noticed again the way the man's eyes checked the whole of him before checking the chart, as if the story might be written somewhere, not on paper. The conversation was clear and careful. Words like management and comfort and intervals found a cadence between them. The doctor mentioned possibilities for therapy, did not push named risks without gilding. Jack listened, then asked 2 questions he had written down in blunt pencil. He did not ask the third, the one that began with the word why. The doctor would not have an answer that language could respect. They shook hands, a clasp that recognized limits and strength at once. Back home, he opened the curtains wide and let the room become lighter than it had been in weeks. He took the card from the sugar bowl and moved it to the mantel, then moved it again to the table where he kept the mail. Then finally set it on the refrigerator door with a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. He stood there and looked at the small sun and the long-legged stick figures and felt foolish tears threaten to make an argument. He did not let them. He did not let them either. He poured warm water, cut another lemon, and this time the seeds did not fall into the cup. He took this as a good omen, then laughed at himself for believing in such things, only to realize that sometimes a man needs unreasonable emblems to keep his steps in order. The pain woke him in the middle of the night, sharp and brief, and then left as if it had simply forgotten something and needed to run back to fetch it. He sat on the edge of the bed with his feet planted, spine long, head bowed. He counted the heartbeats and found them all present. He whispered a sentence he barely heard himself say. As long as there is breath, there is a next step. He framed it not as defiance, but as instruction. The dark in the room was not hostile. It was a cloak. He rose, went to the living room, and pulled from the bottom shelf a pair of shoes he had not worn in a season, and laced them slowly. He sat there with the tied laces and looked at his hands. They were not the hands of a dying man or a living man. They were simply his hands, and that seemed to him in the moment like a revelation. Before dawn, a thin line of light stretched across the horizon like a promise that did not need to speak for itself. He stepped onto the porch and felt the morning's cool pass through the fabric of his shirt. He walked to the end of the block, turned, walked back, turned again, let the rhythm carve a groove in him. When the first sun touched his face, he stopped and stood with it. In that small pause, he who had measured so much lately decided to measure differently. He would not count down days. He would count up steps. The arithmetic felt truer to a body that wanted movement more than it wanted knowledge of endings. He lifted his chin, took another step, and then another. Later that morning, a small thump sounded at the door, the kind of noise a paper makes when it meets wood. He found a second drawing slid under the crack, this one more ambitious. The stick figures had been replaced by round heads with ears and eyebrows, and the sun was still exuberant, but now shared the sky with clouds shaped like dogs. In the corner, written carefully, the boy had added, "Run soon, Mr. Jack. I be fast, you be fast too." The scrawl of a signature ran uphill as if it had gotten excited. He stood in the doorway with the drawing in both hands and realized the day had decided on his behalf that it would be a good one. In the evening, he returned to the memorial wall, not for sorrow, but for calibration. The stone gathered the last light of day and tempered it, made it bearable to look at. He touched the name again, and this time it felt like touching an altar. He did not ask the dead for anything. He spoke to them without words to report that he had found a way to continue that honored what they had taught him in a place far away, and a time too present. The earth under his feet was cool. The grass had the exact scent of a memory he could not place. When he turned to walk home, he did so with the careful dignity of a man taking a new oath. He slept that night more deeply than he had in a month. When the dark rolled back and the room blued, he woke before the alarm he had not set. He drank warm water and lemon, the ceremony becoming a sacrament. He stood barefoot in a square of sunlight that fell like a benediction on the kitchen floor. He laced his shoes and stepped into the day with an attention so keen it made everything he saw, mailbox, sparrow neighbor's porch, swing into an emblem. He did not plan beyond noon. He did not imagine more than a week. He kept the space in front of him small enough to own and large enough to hope in. The first mile would be 1 block long. The second mile would present itself when it was ready. When the afternoon arrived, he found himself at the pond, the willow making green sentences with its long commas. He sat on the bench and listened to the water, a language older than injury. A mother pushed a stroller past and offered a nod that meant, "I see you." A boy on a bicycle attempted a wheelie and settled for a laugh. Somewhere behind him a dog barked and then reconsidered. He watched the sky consider what kind of blue it wanted to be, then pick one and commit. He rose, stretched the way he remembered from a younger body, and began to walk the perimeter of the pond. The path was on a track, and he was not training. He was moving in a way that allowed the body to write itself in simple sentences. I am. I am still. I am still here. At the end of the day, he laid the second drawing on the refrigerator below the first and used another lighthouse magnet to pin it there. 2 sons watched him now from across the room. He made a small meal of greens, potatoes, and a carrot cut on the bias because it pleased him to do so. He cleaned the kitchen with a sense of order, learned from barracks and kitchens and hospital rooms. He sat at the table and wrote a number of words in a small notebook that had become a ledger of days, what he drank, what he ate, how many steps, where the pain had been, and how it had behaved. The practice steadied him. It gave the days texture. He closed the book, set it on the table not far from the lighthouse magnet's line of sight, and went to bed before the television could talk him into a stupor he did not want. The next morning, he walked a little farther. The morning after that, he added a hill. He let the breath teach him, and he listened. He allowed the sun to make an argument not for invincibility, but for possibility. He gave his body leaves and roots and water that had been asked to be more than water. He tended himself the way a man tends a garden he once abandoned and has decided it deserves another season. The future did not grow larger, but it grew clearer. And that felt, for now, like enough. Somewhere behind him in the house, a refrigerator door held 2 drawings in place, and the small suns in those drawings glowed without electricity, luminous because someone believed in him enough to color them that way. When the 4th dawn of this new arrangement arrived, he stood on the porch and felt a tremor of fear and a tremor of resolve meet in him, and agree to keep company. He gave them both room. He understood finally that the line between fear and resolve is not a battlefront but a bridge. He crossed it with a step so measured it looked like hesitation, then with a second that looked like consent. The 3-month horizon sat where it sat, quiet and sure of itself. He did not attempt to argue with it. He stepped into the day, instead a man with a body making trouble for its own ending. A man with 2 drawings on his refrigerator and a wall in the park that taught him what names can mean. He went forward because forward was what breath wanted. He woke before the sun again, as if some quiet officer had tapped him on the shoulder in the dark and said it was time to form up. The room held the blue that comes just before day decides to begin. He lay still and listened for the old drum under his ribs, not with dread this time, but with a deliberate attention like checking a radio before a patrol. The beat was there, imperfect but loyal. He placed his palm on the spot where pain had drawn its map and allowed the breath to widen around it. Then he swung his legs to the floor and sat on the edge of the bed long enough to feel weight settle into his feet, a ceremonial pause before a change of orders. In the kitchen he cut a lemon, the rind releasing a brightness he could almost see in the dim light. Warm water filled the mug. The juice slid in like a line of morning light under a door, carrying with it a scent that reminded him of long-ago summers when thirst was solved by simple things. He drank slowly, not because anyone had told him to, but because ceremony had to be earned by pace. The liquid reached into him with a gentle insistence and made the body feel less like a problem and more like a landscape he might learn again. He cupped the mug in both hands and stood where the first stripe of gold touched the kitchen floor. He did not pray exactly. He addressed the day with a promise too plain to call a prayer: "I will meet you where you meet me." Outside, the air was thin with night cool. He walked the length of the block, then another, letting his steps find the cadence he used to call march discipline. Not fast, not slow, simply honest. When the sun rose enough to warm his forearms, he turned his face toward it and let the skin drink. He counted silently to a number that felt right and returned to the shade. It was new, this classroom of light. He kept to the front row, attentive and not greedy. As he walked, he rehearsed a sentence he had not yet spoken aloud to anyone but himself: he would refuse chemotherapy. Not because he did not respect the science, not because he was brave or stubborn, but because every instinct in him, trained by years of surviving what should have ended him, told him his small remaining time should be shaped by clarity and movement and the food of the earth by discipline he could own and changes he could feel. He did not mistake instinct for certainty. He simply understood that a good decision sometimes begins as the smallest, cleanest sentence. Back home, the kitchen became a quiet engine. He rinsed greens under water that flickered them into brighter versions of themselves. Dandelion leaves with their serrated honesty, celery ribs with their unpretending snap. A beet bled into the sink like a dramatic actor and made him smile for the first time that morning. He loved its refusal to be subtle. Potatoes waited with peasant patience. Carrots offered their cheerful orange as if color alone could encourage endurance. A pale daikon, unassuming, leaned against the cutting board like a long thought. He fed them in measured turns into the machine whose blade made a hummingbird of the air. The juice came out the color of determination, at once earthy and luminous. It tasted like a conversation the body had been trying to start for years. He drank it with the same attention he used to give orders, slowly, clearly, until the last syllable was finished. In the afternoon, he rode the bus to the clinic and watched the city go by as if it were a film he had once seen and was seeing again for the first time. People performed their small choreographies, walking dogs, carrying coffees, speaking into the air as if calling out coordinates only they could read. It reassured him that the world kept its own beat. At the clinic, the lighting was warm, as if those who built the building had wanted to soften what words would do in its rooms. He checked in, sat down, and read the same paragraph on a poster twice without realizing it. When his name was called, he rose and followed the nurse through corridors where footsteps made an acceptable music. Dr. Alan Pierce entered with the quiet competence Jack had come to value. The doctor's presence had no swagger and no sag. It held the exact weight of responsibility. He greeted Jack by name and sat without hurry, opening the chart as if it were not a set of numbers and images but a story they were reading together. They spoke of lab values, of scans, of margins and millimeters. They spoke, too, of how Jack was sleeping and what foods he could tolerate and whether pain had changed its habits. Only after the update settled did Jack say in a voice that surprised him by its steadiness that he did not intend to pursue chemotherapy. He did not add the long interior explanation. He did not argue with a man who had nothing to do with the existence of the cliff, but had kindly drawn maps around it. Dr. Pierce listened as if the words were instruments in an orchestra, and he wished to hear each distinct and all together. He asked careful questions that were not tests, but invitations to clarity. Did Jack understand the potential benefits of treatment? Did he understand the risks? Did he have support at home? What was he planning to do instead? Jack answered without defensiveness. He explained about sun in the morning and walking that might become running, and a plate that would welcome only plants. He spoke about water with lemon and greens and roots pressed into juice, about wanting his final months, if that was what they would be shaped by, days he could recognize as his. The doctor did not nod too soon. When he did, it was not concession but respect. There was a silence in which the room made a small sound one only hears after important sentences end. Dr. Pierce said he would continue to follow Jack closely. Order periodic imaging, manage symptoms that rose, and be honest whenever the facts changed. He did not promise and did not discourage. He said one other thing that Jack kept: "If you are choosing presence, then be present in the choosing too. Do not do it alone." Jack left with a printed schedule and the peculiar relief of having named something out loud. The days arranged themselves around the new oath he had taken, an oath that did not need a flag or uniform to be real. He woke, drank warm water, and Lemon stepped into the first light as if stepping into a conversation already in progress. He walked until walking remembered how to become a gentle, run a shuffle at first that made him laugh quietly at the thought that speed was less important than sincerity. On the third morning, a crow paced him for half a block and then flew up as if to say that shared effort had been enough. On the fifth morning, his ankles spoke in small complaints. He answered by stopping to stretch his hands on the cool bark of a tree that had watched decades pass without comment. In the kitchen, he learned the choreography of preparation. He brushed earth from beets with something like reverence. He washed dandelion leaves until the water ran clean. He trimmed celery and cut carrots on the diagonal because the angle pleased his eye. Potatoes he steamed and ate warm with a scattering of fresh herbs and a pinch of salt, the simplicity of it so honest it put a calm in his chest. He told no one about the calm. It was a private treaty between him and the hours. He kept a notebook on the table and wrote numbers and small phrases, minutes in the sun blocks, walked ounces of juice, pain a 3 today, then a 2, so the days would not blur, but instead make a legible line he could follow. Sometimes fatigue fell on him like a coat he had not ordered. He did not interpret it as defeat. He sat down. He learned that rest could be a discipline too. In the afternoons he would step into the shade and close his eyes and count to 60, then open them to find the world still willing to wait for him. On a Tuesday, he walked to the pond and watched geese make a slow V across water printed with light. On a Thursday, he cleaned out a drawer that had become a museum of small failures, rubber bands that had given up batteries with nothing to give a screwdriver whose head no longer fit anything. He threw away what was done and kept what had another use in it. It felt like a metaphor he did not need to name. Billy appeared now and then at the edge of his days like an exclamation point written by life itself. The boys' greetings were weather reports and game scores and running commentary on the mysterious politics of third-grade friendships. He brought one afternoon a paper bracelet he had cut from construction paper and stapled crookedly. Runners only it read in letters that forgot to be straight. Jack slid it over his wrist and wore it until the evening dishwater dissolved it into pulp, then laid the softened strip on the windowsill to dry like a fallen leaf. The boy's faith in him, unguarded, unresearched, was a medicine he had not expected. Sarah phoned once from 2 towns away. She had heard from a friend of a friend that he was stepping into mornings with more purpose than fear. Her voice had the texture of someone who had learned endurance the way one learns an instrument, one patient practice at a time. She spoke of her own rebuild, of the way food and rest and gentle motion had put her back into herself after a season of treatments that took almost everything. She did not preach. She offered what she had and left space where he might put his own story if he wanted to. When the call ended, he stood on the porch and looked at the sky until the gratitude in his throat had somewhere to go. Weeks began to make a soft architecture. He measured progress not in miles but in tolerance's less breathlessness on a little hill. Fewer stabs of pain when he twisted to reach a top shelf, more minutes in the sun before his skin asked for shade. Sleep, once a torn line, became a more continuous thread. He woke sometimes to a dream of running through grass that was both the high country of his youth and the matted edges of a jungle he had outlived. In the dream, he ran with men whose names were on a wall, and when he woke, the ache of that blessing was not sorrow, but a stern kind of encouragement. One afternoon, weariness rose like a slow tide. He lay on the sofa with the window open a hand's width and listened to the neighborhood breathe. A delivery truck hissed and moved. Someone across the street laughed and then stopped as if surprised by having done it. The smell of cut grass slid into the room and made a green of his thoughts. He slept. When he woke, the room had reassembled itself around a quieter man. He rose and made a juice as if building a small raft and climbing onto it. The beet stained his fingers. He did not scrub the color away. Back at the clinic, the phlebotomist found his vein on the first try. Small victories mattered. Dr. Pierce reviewed the latest numbers with a face that refused to oversell hope or lean on despair. Liver enzymes like weather, sometimes stormy, sometimes merely gray. Scans scheduled for a date that sounded close and far at once. The doctor asked about appetite. Jack answered that his appetite had learned new manners. He asked about pain. Jack answered that it had become a less dramatic guest. At the end of the visit, the doctor looked up from the chart and into Jack's face with a steadiness that felt like a hand placed not heavy, not light on a shoulder. Presence, the look said, repeating the word from last time. They shook hands, and Jack left with the next appointment, and something that could not be printed, a sense that his path, even if narrow, was his. It rained the next morning, a steady thread of water that stitched sky to street. He walked anyway, hat pulled low, jacket zipped. The rain tapped his shoulders like a drummer finding a rhythm, and the cool air made his lungs remember gratitude. He kept his head up and his gaze near. The world at 30 feet was enough. He moved past a bakery that filled the block with a smell like the memory of warmth. He passed the barber shop where men came not only to lose hair, but to recover stories. He passed the small church that had somehow learned to welcome silence on weekdays. Each threshold he crossed without entering felt like a note in a scale he had once learned and was learning again. When the rain stopped, the world shone the way a child's drawing does when covered by a protective sheet. Billy rode past on his bicycle with a plastic grocery bag over the seat like a saddle blanket, the ingenuity of it making Jack's mouth tilt. The boy shouted something about a school race and then was gone, impatience burning off the last wet. On the corner, a woman knelt to leash a dog that had no concept of mortality and every concept of joy. Jack thought not for the first time that perhaps the art now was to be more like this animal fully present in the business of being. Running came in honest increments. He jogged the width of one house, then walked two, then jogged another. The heart pounded, but did not riot. The breath shortened, but did not panic. He kept his jaw soft and his hands open the way someone once taught him in a different training for a different survival. Days layered into a routine that did not feel like a trap because he could change the tempo when he needed to. He learned the texture of fatigue that asked for stopping, and the different texture of fatigue that asked for patience. He answered each with the right kind of halt. He did not tell the wall his progress, but he visited it. On a bright afternoon, he stood again before the names and touched the same letters and let the coolness of stone balance the warmth of his skin. He offered no grand declarations to the dead and received no reply. The exchange was nevertheless complete. He turned away from the wall, not with victory, but with alignment, as if some inner compass that had been rusted by fear had finally found north. In the kitchen that evening, he pressed greens until the machine's hum became a kind of hymn. He steamed potatoes and broke them open with a fork, watching the soft cloud of their insides rise. He added a spoon of olive oil and a whisper of salt. He ate standing at the counter, bare feet on tile, a man feeding a life that had decided to negotiate. The notebook accepted his neat lines. He wrote, Sun 22 miners. Walk run 22 blocks. Pain 2. Sha 1. Appetite good. Sleep. Laugh 1. The last entry made him laugh again. The next day was a good day, and the next a middling one, and the next a mixture that felt truer than either. A week later, after a morning thick with fog, he felt an old surge of energy and took the long way home, adding a hill that glanced at him with skepticism and then accepted him. At the top, he stood with his hands on his hips and looked out over the neighborhood's roofs and trees and thin power lines, a modest kingdom made luminous by the effort of reaching it. He closed his eyes and let the wind cross his face. He stood like that for a count of 10, and at the count of 11, a cough climbed his throat and insisted on being born. The cough began as an ordinary clearing and then sharpened. He bent, braced his hands on his knees, and coughed again. Something metallic ghosted his tongue. He saw on the back of his hand where he'd covered his mouth a small red starburst that should not have been there. He straightened slowly and looked at the sky, because looking at the ground would have been an admission he was not ready to make. The wind still moved. The roofs still held. The day did not cancel itself on his behalf. He breathed once, twice, 3 times, and felt the chest accept the air. He wiped his hand with a handkerchief and folded the cloth as a man folds a flag after a ceremony, precise, steady, unwilling to create a drama where what was needed was composure. Then he started down the hill step by measured step, a soldier who knew that sometimes retreat is not surrender but strategy, and that the next move must be chosen, not guessed. He did not run that afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table with the handkerchief washed and drying on the radiator and listened to the tick of the clock that glided rather than ticked. He warmed water, squeezed lemon, and drank not because it would solve anything but because it had become part of how he met the day. The room did not waver. The sun, finding him through the window, laid a bar of light across his forearms like a stripe, a quiet badge for showing up. Night came early and gently. He lay in bed and listened for the drum under his ribs and found it willing. He put his hand on it as if on a prayer book and said the sentence again more slowly, as if teaching it to a child. As long as there is breath, there is a next step. The cough would be addressed. The plan would hold or be rewritten. The oath would remain. And in the first unsteady hour before dawn, the city's quiet officer tapped his shoulder again. He rose to meet whatever the morning would ask of him. By the time the first green tips dared themselves onto the willow branches by the pond, Jack's mornings had begun to feel less like sentences to be served and more like invitations to be answered. The sun rose a few minutes earlier each day, drawing him out with a warmer kind of insistence. His steps, once a negotiation between will and ache, were now finding their own momentum, a rhythm stitched from patience. On some mornings he would lift his gaze from the ground long enough to watch geese pass overhead, their angled flight a geometry of trust. On others he would notice the way frost surrendered to light in slow dissolves along the grass. The body, though still scarred by its interior war, had started to speak a slightly different language. Pain was not gone, but it no longer introduced itself with the arrogance of an uninvited guest. Breath came easier, chest opening like a window left ajar on a mild day. His calves no longer burned at the first hill, and his hands, once prone to swelling by the end of a walk, now hung loose at his sides, swinging in a casual pact with the road. One morning, on the edge of the park, he saw a cluster of runners gathered around a picnic table, scattered with paper cups of water. They were lean in that way people become when movement is not an occasional guest but a daily tenant. A woman with a pink cap and a smile that seemed to warm the cold air met his eyes. She nodded a small acknowledgment that he belonged here, even if he had not yet earned the uniform of their pace. Later, he would learn her name was Sarah and that her own legs had once been slowed by the same kind of hospital hours he knew too well. At first, Jack kept his distance, content to watch their pre-run stretches the brief burst of conversation before the whistle the way they leaned into the first steps, as if they had been waiting all week for that moment. Then, on a windy Saturday, Sarah waved him over with a hand that carried no expectation, only inclusion. He joined them for a single lap around the park, half walking, half shuffling, and found the air richer in company. Someone clapped his shoulder as they passed the starting bench, and the gesture planted itself in him like a seed. They spoke little, and when they did, it was the language of runner's distance, whether the small triumph of shaving seconds off a route. But between those lines was something else, something he recognized from the field, an unspoken pact to keep moving forward together. After a few weekends, Jack realized he was looking for their bright shirts in the park, even on the days he wasn't running. The weeks unfolded with a steadying regularity. Lemon water at dawn sunlight on the porch walks that shaded into runs the whir of the juicer, the earthy sweet taste of beets staining his tongue. He began to fill a second notebook, each page, a quilt of numbers, brief observations, and occasional one-line weather reports. Sun, warm, wind, sharp legs, steady. There were more 2s than 3s now on his pain scale. Sleep was deeper dreams, more vivid. He started to suspect that the body, given the right conditions, could rehearse its own rescue. Then the phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, and the air inside the house changed shape. The voice on the other end belonged to an old army buddy, and it carried the weight of someone calling from a greater distance than miles. The news came without cushioning. Tom Willis, one of the few men left who knew the texture of those years overseas, had died of liver cancer. There was a pause in which both men on the line seemed to look out the same invisible window. They spoke for a few more minutes, the sentences collapsing into silences too short to be comfortable, too long to ignore. After the call, Jack sat at the table with his hands around a mug that had gone cold. The next morning, he didn't run, nor the morning after. He told himself he was resting, that a pause was part of discipline. But he knew better. The truth was that the shadow he had been out pacing had caught him, reminding him how fragile this new ground was. Tom had been younger, fitter in many ways, and yet the disease had claimed him. Jack stared at the refrigerator door at Billy's drawings of the two of them running under impossible suns, and felt an ache that was neither muscle nor liver. It was somewhere older. On the third day of stillness, a sound at the porch broke the spell. He opened the door to find Billy, his left leg bound in a bright blue cast, sitting in a wheelchair with his mother behind him. The boy's face was a mix of pride and frustration, the pride for having a story, the frustration for not being able to move. He thrust out his hand, and in it was a headband stitched with uneven letters, "Keep running." The thread wandered letters tilting uphill, but the message was clear enough to pass any inspection. Jack took it in both hands, the fabric warm from the boy's grip. For a moment he didn't trust his voice, so he simply nodded. Billy grinned like the sun in his own drawings and said something about a bike and a curb and not paying attention, but Jack barely heard. The headband felt like a baton handed off in a race he hadn't realized he was still running. That evening he registered for a 5K scheduled 3 months out. The act felt less like signing up for a race and more like signing a pact with Billy, with Tom's memory with the stubborn drum under his ribs. He wrote the date in his notebook, underlined it twice, and closed the cover with the kind of resolve that doesn't need to be loud to be absolute. Training began in careful increments. He alternated walking and jogging, marking each small victory in the margins of his days. The runners at the park welcomed him into their Saturday loops, their quiet companionship acting as ballast. Sarah ran beside him often, her stride, even her breath, steady, her presence a reminder that survival could be an art as well as an accident. On good days he would add an extra block to his route. On less good days he would slow but still move. The headband became part of his uniform, the faded letters a flag only he and Billy needed to salute. Each time the fabric soaked through with sweat, he would rinse it, dry it, and set it on the windowsill for the next morning. It became, like the lemon water and the juice, a ritual that anchored him. One afternoon, with the 5K less than a month away, he pushed a little harder up a hill that had been mocking him since winter. The wind at the top felt like applause. But halfway down the other side, a tightness grabbed at the back of his right leg sharp enough to force him into a limp. He slowed to a walk, then to a stop, resting his hand on a fence post while the muscle pulsed in protest. He knew this kind of warning. It was the body's way of drawing a line in the dirt, daring him to cross without consequence. The sun was lowering shadows stretching across the road like questions. He stood there, the taste of copper at the back of his throat, listening to the thud of his heartbeat in his ears. The park was empty now, the path home longer than he remembered. Jack took one slow step, then another, the ache following like an uninvited escort. He wasn't sure yet whether this was a temporary rebellion or a full mutiny. All he knew was that the race date was written in ink, and the headband was waiting on the windowsill. The hill behind him, the path ahead, both seemed steeper than before. The hill's insult lingered for days. What had started as a tight knot in the back of his leg settled into a persistent ache that flared whenever he tried to stretch too far or walk too quickly. Jack found himself limping without meaning to the rhythm of his gait, broken like a sentence cut mid-word. Each time he caught his reflection in a shop window or a parked car, he noticed how carefully he was guarding that leg as though the wrong step could undo weeks of effort. For the first time in months, mornings felt heavier. The headband Billy had made still sat on the windowsill, its letters curling slightly where the thread had loosened, but he couldn't bring himself to tie it around his head. He told himself it was just caution, that rest was part of training, but under that was another truth, the fear of sliding back into the stillness he had fought so hard to leave. He kept the lemon water in the morning, the sun on his skin, the juice in the glass. But the runs, the way they burned away, doubt with every footfall, were missing. Without them, the days seemed longer, their edges blurred. The ache in his leg became a metronome for his thoughts, ticking out a slow rhythm that reminded him time was not pausing just because he had. It was on the fourth day of this restless rest that Sarah knocked on his door. Her smile was there, but behind it was something like intent. She didn't ask how the leg was. Instead, she said she was driving to the children's hospital across town and thought he might like to come along. She didn't explain further, and he didn't ask. Sometimes the best way to accept an invitation is to step into it before you've decided whether you're ready. The hospital's front entrance was bright with spring banners, the air just inside carrying the faint scent of antiseptic, wrapped in something sweeter, maybe from the gift shop's flowers. They walked down hallways where murals of forests and oceans tried to make ceilings disappear. Jack felt the quiet discipline of the place, how voices softened, how footsteps seemed to arrange themselves so as not to disturb the air. In one ward, a group of children were gathered around a low table, painting paper crowns with sequins and glitter. A boy, no older than 7, sat in a wheelchair, his scalp bare, his eyes the deep color of a storm over open water. He held a paintbrush like it was a sword. When Sarah introduced Jack simply as my friend, the boy looked at him for a long moment, then handed him a gold star sticker without ceremony. Jack took it as if it were a medal. They stayed for over an hour. He listened more than he spoke, watching the way the children inhabited their small worlds with an energy that ignored the machines beside them. There were IV poles decorated with ribbons, hospital gowns turned into canvases for drawings. He saw the way parents' faces shifted when their children laughed, how the laugh seemed to rebuild something in them, brick by invisible brick. When they left, Sarah didn't speak right away. In the parking lot, Jack felt the star sticker still pressed against his palm where he had kept it. "You know," she finally said, "sometimes the body follows the spirit, not the other way around." The next morning he'd put on the headband. The leg was still tender, but he decided to walk to the park anyway. He told himself he wouldn't push, wouldn't test the hill. Yet, when the path curved toward it, he didn't turn away. The incline was slow and steady, the kind that asks more than it demands. Halfway up, he felt the pull in the muscle, but not the sharpness from before. At the top, he stopped, caught his breath, and let the city spread out beneath him like an opened map. From then on, he added a little more. Each day, longer strides, a short jog, the kind of motion that rebuilds trust between body and mind. 3 weeks later, the ache had softened into memory. The morning of the 5K, the sky was a clear, pale blue, the air cool enough to make breath visible. The park was alive with movement runners pinning numbers to shirts, volunteers setting out cups of water music pulsing faintly from a loudspeaker. Jack stood near the starting line, feeling the pulse of the crowd settle into his own chest. He wore the headband, the thread of its letters now faded but still legible, still carrying Billy's determination in every stitch. When the horn sounded, he didn't sprint. He let the faster runners pull ahead, keeping his stride easy, his breath measured. Sarah appeared at his side for a stretch, her pace steady, her presence wordless encouragement. He thought about Tom, about the children in the hospital ward, about the boy with the storm-colored eyes and the gold star. He thought about Billy, who was somewhere on the course with his mother waiting near the finish line. The course wound through familiar streets past the pond under the willow branches. Neighbors stood on porches clapping some calling names, others just smiling. At the halfway mark, Jack felt the weight of his own body, the drum under his ribs, but also the lift that comes from knowing each step was carrying him farther than he might have gone. When the finish line came into view, he could see Billy waving from his wheelchair, the cast now covered with signatures and doodles. Jack's stride lengthened, the cheers folding around him like a warm coat. Crossing the line, he felt no need to raise his arms or shout. The quiet in his chest was enough. Later, standing off to the side with a cup of water, he looked into the camera of a volunteer who was filming short clips of runners for a local charity event. Without overthinking it, he spoke into the lens. If you're watching this, and you think it's too late to start, trust me, it's not. You don't have to run a race, just take the first step, and keep going. If this story means something to you, subscribe to our channel. Maybe the next step you take will be the one that changes everything. The volunteer smiled, thanked him, and moved on to the next runner. Jack kept the cup in his hand until the water warmed, savoring the small victory in the taste. That evening, he placed the race bib on the refrigerator beside Billy's drawings. The 3 Sons the Stick figures, the fabric headband, it all told the story without needing words. The next morning, the phone rang while he was slicing a lemon. The sound was sharp in the quiet kitchen. Dr. Pierce's voice was calm but carried an urgency that didn't match the weather outside. "Jack, I'd like you to come in. We should talk about your latest results." There was a pause, not long enough to ask questions, just long enough to know they were needed. Jack looked at the half-sliced lemon, the knife resting beside it, and felt the weight of the call settle in the room. Outside, the sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the trees. The clinic's lobby smelled faintly of rain, though the sky outside was an unbroken blue. Jack arrived early, taking a seat by the window where the light angled across the floor in long, pale stripes. He watched the slow turn of dust in the air, each mote moving in its own private current. Somewhere deeper in the building, a phone rang, muted by walls. When the nurse called his name, he rose without hurry, as if moving too fast might wake something he didn't want to disturb. The hallway felt narrower than usual. He caught his reflection in a glass-framed notice board and wondered if he looked different than the man who had first walked here 27 months earlier, when 3 months had been the horizon. Dr. Pierce was already seated in the consultation room, a manila folder closed in front of him. He greeted Jack with the same steady tone he always used, but today there was a different weight behind it, like a hand pressed more firmly on a shoulder. He opened the folder, turned a page, and for a moment only the sound of paper moving filled the space. When he looked up, his eyes held a brightness that words hadn't yet caught up to. "Jack, there's no sign of the cancer. The scans are clear." The sentence landed with the quiet force of a tide reaching farther than expected. For a breath, Jack didn't move. The words seemed to hang in the air, waiting for him to claim them. Then, something in his chest loosened, a knot, tied 27 months ago, began to unspool. He leaned back in the chair, not from shock, but to make room for the sudden flood inside. In that moment, the sterile white of the room dissolved. He saw the frost on the grass that first morning he had tried to run. He tasted the bitterness of the first beet juice, felt the sting of sunlight on winter skin. He heard Billy's laughter from the curb, Sarah's measured breath beside him on the path, the faint hum of the juicer, turning roots into liquid discipline. He felt the ache of the hill in his leg, the soft resilience of the headband, the quiet defiance of every step taken against the arithmetic of prognosis. He realized that somewhere along the way, the finish line he'd been chasing had moved beyond survival. He hadn't been running only for himself. He had been running with the ghosts of his unit, with Tom's absence, with the children in the hospital who had shown him how to live inside a fragile body without surrendering the spirit. Dr. Pierce spoke again, explaining that the scans would continue at regular intervals, that there was always a need for vigilance. Jack listened, nodded. The words were important, but they were landing on soil already changed by the first sentence. Outside, the day had turned warmer. He walked the long way home, each step measured but light. At the park, he stopped by the pond, the willows green now in full voice. The surface of the water caught the sky and held it without trembling. Jack sat on the bench where he had once rested after barely managing a lap and stayed until the sun slid lower. That night, he didn't sleep right away. He sat at his kitchen table with both notebooks open, tracing the months with his finger page, by page numbers short lines about weather pain levels, distances. It read less like a medical log and more like a chronicle of becoming. Near the end, he found the underlined date of the 5K and smiled. He took out a blank page and wrote in careful letters, Marathon. The decision felt less like ambition and more like gratitude given form. Not to prove the body's victory over illness, but to honor the fact that there were still miles left to run and people living and gone who deserved to be carried in each step. The next morning, he laced his shoes before dawn. The air was cool, the streets hushed. He ran a familiar route, but this time he noticed more the tilt of a mailbox, the particular gray of a fence post, the scent of bread from a bakery vent. Each detail felt like proof of presence. Later, sitting on the porch with a glass of water, he thought about how much of this journey had been unseen by anyone but him, and yet sharing it had turned it into something larger. He picked up his phone, opened the camera, and began speaking, not rehearsed, not polished. When they told me I had 3 months, I started counting down. Then I decided to count forward instead. 1 step, 1 sip, 1 sunrise at a time. 27 months later, I'm still running. If you've made it this far into my story, maybe you're looking for your own first step. Take it. And if you want to see where this road leads, subscribe to the channel. Let's keep running together. He posted the clip without watching it back then, set the phone aside. That afternoon, he registered for the marathon. The form asked for an emergency contact, and for the first time in years, he wrote down a name without hesitation. Sarah. He imagined telling her, imagined her smile turning into that nod she gave when someone had done something worth the effort. As evening came, he walked to the memorial wall. The stone was warm from the day's sun. He placed his palm flat against Lucas M. Hale's name and let the heat seep into him. No words passed between them, but the silence felt like approval. On the way home, he passed Billy's house. The boy was outside the cast, now gone, both legs propelling him in wide loops around the yard. He waved when he saw Jack, then pointed at his own head and mimed tying on the headband. Jack laughed, lifted a hand in return, and kept walking, the light stretching long ahead of him. The morning of the marathon began before the city had decided to wake. Jack stood by his kitchen counter tying the headband with its faded letters, the thread now frayed in places where sweat and time had worn it down. On the refrigerator, the race bib from his 5K still hung beside Billy's drawings, their suns shining over stick figures in perpetual motion. He touched the edge of one drawing, then picked up his lemon, cut it cleanly, and poured its juice into warm water. The ritual felt heavier today, as if each step of it was being quietly recorded somewhere. Outside, the air was cool enough to raise the skin on his forearms, but not enough to stiffen his legs. He wore a plain shirt, white with black letters across the chest. 3 months to live, 27 months running. As he walked toward the start area, the city's early light stretched long across the pavement. Volunteers in bright vests arranged cones and tables. Runners warmed up in small pockets, each in their own space between anticipation and focus. At the starting line, he found a place near the middle of the pack. The chatter around him was low, but constant, the language of pacing strategies, of weather, of gratitude for good knees. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening instead to the slow thud of his heart. When the horn sounded, the crowd surged forward in one slow wave, shoes slapping pavement breath, finding rhythm. The first mile passed under a canopy of trees, their leaves shifting in the morning breeze. Jack kept his stride, even letting faster runners slip ahead. In his mind, the path opened to another road decades back, jungle mud underfoot, the air heavy with the hum of insects. He saw Lucas ahead of him in the line helmet. Low boots sinking into the muck, the radio strapped to his back, whispering coordinates. He blinked, and the image dissolved into asphalt and cheering neighbors. By mile 5, the city began to open up. Streets that on any other day were choked with cars were now wide and clear. Jack took a cup of water from a volunteer, sipping half, pouring the rest down the back of his neck. He remembered another drink, canteen water gone warm, passed hand to hand in the heat of an afternoon that had no mercy. He remembered the quiet nods exchanged in place of thanks, the kind of acknowledgement that says, "We both know what this costs." Around mile 10, the fatigue began to press in at the edges. He thought of Billy of the boys' cast, covered in signatures of the day he'd rolled up to Jack's porch with a headband in hand. The memory put a lift in his stride. He passed a sign held by a stranger. "Pain is temporary. Pride is forever." It reminded him of a phrase from training long ago. Words shouted over the sound of boots hitting ground, meant to keep men moving when every muscle was pleading to stop. The halfway point came with a swell of noise music from a live band, the smell of grilled food from a nearby stand, hands outstretched for high fives. Jack didn't slow, but he allowed himself a brief glance at the crowd. Somewhere in it he knew Sarah would be watching. By mile 18, his legs had begun to argue. The muscles in his calves and thighs spoke in sharp-clipped sentences, each one ending with an exclamation point. His breath was still steady but deeper now, like drawing air from a well that was beginning to narrow. He focused on small goals, the next lamppost, the next corner, the next patch of shade. Between them, flashes of memory, the sterile white of the consultation room. Dr. Pierce's eyes above the folder, the gold star sticker pressed into his palm by a boy with storm-colored eyes. At mile 22, the course turned back toward the park. Jack could feel the shift, the crowd thicker now, the cheers louder. His body was a negotiation, every step an agreement between will and muscle. The willow by the pond came into view, and he remembered the first lap he had walked there, stopping to catch his breath. Now he ran past it, his shadow stretched long beside him. The final mile curved toward the finish line, the arch ahead strung with banners. And there, just beyond it, Billy's small figure stood in the crowd, waving both arms. Sarah was beside him, her hand on the boy's shoulder, her other arm raised in a cheer that carried above the noise. Jack felt the pull of their faces of this moment, and something in him answered. He lengthened his stride, the ache in his legs giving way to the gravity of arrival. Crossing the line was not a leap, but a continuation. The chip on his shoe beeped as it passed the sensor. Volunteers offered medals, bottles of water, words of congratulations. Billy broke from the barrier, running to him, the headband now slightly crooked from the race. Jack bent, letting the boy wrap small arms around him, feeling the strength in them. Sarah stood closer, eyes bright with the kind of pride that doesn't need explanation. They stood there as the swirl of runners and music and applause, and Jack felt no urgency to leave. This, he realized, was what it meant to finish and still be moving. Later, as the crowd thinned and the afternoon light began to soften, he found a quiet spot near the edge of the park. He looked into the camera on his phone, the medal resting against his shirt. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of the road behind him. "I started this journey thinking it would end in 3 months. It's been more than 2 years. And I've learned that you don't have to know how far the road goes, you just have to take the next step. If you've walked this far with me, subscribe to the channel. Let's keep walking and running together. You never know what's waiting beyond the next mile." He ended the recording, saved it, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. As the sun dipped lower, he walked one last loop around the park. The willow's branches swayed lightly in the breeze, the pond catching the sky in ripples. The memorial wall wasn't far, and he let his steps carry him there. He placed his palm against Lucas M. Hale's name once more. No words, just the pressure of skin to stone, the warmth of the day still in it. When he turned to go, the light was laying a golden path down the sidewalk. Each step felt like a salute, not just to the past, but to the days still ahead. And as he moved into that light, he knew the oath still held as long as there was breath, there would be another step.